AndresBurbano holds a PhD in Media Arts and Technology from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And now he's working as assistant professor at the Department of Design in Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. Muy rica ciudad. Hablamos también español acá, italiano, portugués, todas las lenguas. The title of the presentation is Fotoformas, which is, well, you can talk about. But it's the best because you have a Brazilian example, so we talk about that afterwards.
Thank you very much for attending to this panel. After 3 days, you must be exhausted, but there are still 3 days more, right? So, energy. The title of my presentation is Fotoformas, 1949-1951, Photography and Algorithmic Devices in an Early Interaction. I would like to say that 6 years ago, when I went to my first RE conference in Melbourne, I had the opportunity to speak about this artifact, let's say, one of the first computers made in Germany in 1942 by Konrad Zuse. And I was quite intrigued by the fact that he used a punch film stock to store the data of his computer. This computer, a previous one, and 2 other computers that he made later on. And I was able to identify some of the code in punch in this film that is 8 bits binary code. And I think it's very important that people asking questions about ontologies of digital cinema must go back and learn from this interesting punch film stock. 2 years ago in Riga, I had the opportunity to speak about my doctoral dissertation, and one of the case studies that I presented was this image that we can see right now. It's a very early photographic example made in Brazil as early as 1837. That means that at the same time that photography was created in France, parallel to Daguerre and Fox Talbot in the UK, there was a French-Brazilian guy doing photographic experiments in Sao Paulo state, actually. One of the things that I would like to point out is that given the lack of information in many cases, I needed to switch to the study of some of the pictures that still remain, and then document myself as the best way possible. And I did an engagement with experience trying to do a reconstruction of the technical processes involved in this example. And I think that's a very part of my take on this media art histories, like the involvement in practical way with the material I'm studying. So those 2 examples are just to say that the case study I have for today is something that is exactly in between, mixing bit of code, photographic example, and it comes from Brazil too. I'm going to speak about Geraldo de Barros, one of the first concretista artists in Brazil. I'm going to speak about Fotoformas, that is an exhibition that he put together in 52, but he was exhibiting around 100 pictures made between 49 and 51. Some of the pictures are like this one, you can say classic examples of photography, anyway, looking for some abstraction and interesting geometry and structure. But he quickly started to do experiments with abstract photography. Using this Rolleiflex camera, he was able to take several expositions at the same time and trying to get, gain abstraction through the photographic device. Even more, he started to do lots of experiments in his Fotoformas, also, developing the photos and then scratching and drawing on the film in a similar way that McLaren did for his film Blankety Blank, right? A Canadian example. This is one of my favorite examples. You can see like the shoe is a photographic picture, and then later on he was able to scratch and draw on top of it. Of course, I started to inquire about the materiality of this thing, how he was able to make this. And I found the archive in Switzerland that his daughter runs. It's a very interesting archive with some of the material, and I was incredibly fascinated with finding the negatives and seeing this mixture of technical image acquired by chemical means and the gesture of his hand, scratching, drawing on top of that film. Even more in his other experiments that are more abstract, because he definitely switched from, let's say, more figurative photography to a very interesting case of abstract photography. He started to cut the negative, flip part of the negative, intervene the negative, mix some negatives. These are some interesting examples. And interestingly enough, this thing hasn't been discussed that much in the history of photography. So recently, only recently, there are like a couple of guys who are trying to make sense of the abstract photography of the 20th century. And Geraldo de Barros is one of the most interesting case studies, in my opinion. There's at least 3 interesting concepts to describe this kind of photography. That is abstract photography, undisclosed images, that is one that I like a lot, or concrete photography, for instance. However, despite I was very intrigued with this, the negatives that he was able to manipulate to create like these complex images. There are 7 pictures, 7 photographic works in this series that have no negative. Okay, so how is that possible? This guy, making, cutting, editing the negatives, and there is no negative for this image, and neither for this other one. That intrigued me more, and I started to say, oh, you know what? This looks like computer-based stuff. It's repetitive, geometric, and so on. And probably with this example that we are showing now, you eventually can grasp that he was working, instead of the negative, photographic negative, with punch cards, coming from a tabulating machine, right? So this is a quite tantalizing finding to me, because what we are looking at are, images made with the thing that has been called the first icon of the information age, and this is 49 in Brazil. He was able to take these punch cards to the lab, in a kind of performative way, play with that, change the negative, place instead of the negative, the punch card, and eventually starting to play with that. And I think it is pointing to a very interesting and important part of the history of the 20th century. That, for instance, in the States, Stephen Luber has been writing a lot about the impact, cultural impact of the punch cards. Right, that since at least the census of the 18th centuries was incredibly important for American culture. And on the other hand, Eden Medina, for instance, has been doing an amazing job telling the history of the IBM company and the punch cards related to the IBM company in Latin America. The creation of the first 2 offices outside of the state. Was in Latin America, in Chile, had like the first office outside of the States, IBM, right? Becoming then multinational. So thinking of these examples, intriguing examples of 2 materialities interacting, the photochemical stuff and the code that is somehow punching these cards, make me think, about how to tell this story. And how to embrace it theoretically. One of the things, materiality is one thing that has been discussed in this conference in very interesting ways. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is, when I see these physical supports of code, is the voice of Hitler coming to say, there is no software, right? There is no software, it's hardware. And we need to study this, engage this materiality thing with the idea of software again, the hardware again. But there's more, of course. I had the opportunity to get the information from the archives in Switzerland, and I could see that they eventually, for instance, to classify these images, they used the word radiogram in French or radiograph in English. So there are many questions. I will share some of them with you, right? So the first question is, are these photo formats, the ones made with punch cards, radiographs? Are these photo formats, this photographic, ready-made eventually? Are these photo formats computer graphics before computer graphics? That's one thing that intrigues me. So, some answers. First of all, I don't think there's an appropriate word to call those radiograms, because radiograms are mainly traces of physical objects on top of photographic paper. And in this case, we are having the projection of them larger than and the intervention. So I think it's a different thing. I thought eventually one interesting way to say that is photography or photoinfography, but I still need to think on that. The other thing is that when I started to switch, from the material thing to the social network around him, why he was interested in punch cards, I discovered that he, at the time, was working part-time in the Banco do Brasil, and part-time in his studio. And he was interacting with the people, manipulating the tabulating machines. And what he did was ask them when they have defective cards or they made mistakes punching the cards in this process of, punching the data, to give those, broken and wrong, with the wrong code cards to him. So this means that he was working with the glitches, kind of, right, with the errors coming out of this machine. Actually, these are the tabulating machines that the Banco do Brasil was using at the time, an IBM 414. So let's keep moving. Eventually, I will engage now with a more intriguing question. So is this computer graphics before computer graphics? Eventually, Darko, I think, already mentioned the importance of Valdemar Cordeiro in Brazilian culture, one artist who made one of these first pieces of computer arts in Brazil, but at the same time, between the 60s and 70s, at the same time played an amazing role interfacing with what was happening in Eastern Europe, especially with the New Tendencies movement. So what happens is that Valdemar Cordeiro and Geraldo de Barros, they created the group Ruptura. And they share this interest on the ideas of what happens when an artist confronts with a machine and engages with these kind of things. But also they take other things that are rare in this field, that is like the social questions around that. Like this, for instance, these images that we are looking at, Valdemar Cordeiro engaged with the idea of representing indigenous culture, for instance, at the time, and things like that. So I think that there's a lot of room to elaborate more about this relationship between this first, let's say, classic computer art made in Latin America and these early examples like Geraldo de Barros' work. On the other hand, of course, this points to the question of what is the story of the punch cards? And there is like interesting stories. Many people point to Jacquard because of the Jacquard loom. That is probably a very, very important thing here in Montreal because your interest is in textiles. But I think there's also, thank you, okay. There's also the one guy even before, that is Beausançon, is that French? Yeah. The guy who made the duck, the digestive duck. Exactly. He was using punch cards before Jacquard. Apparently, Jacquard took the idea from him. So this is very interesting. Another interesting thing is that I went to the London Museum of Science to explore the punch cards that were used in the analytical engine in the computer made by Charles Babbage, right? And he was using already the punch cards in two different sets, like instructions. Okay, 3 minutes more, that's good. For instructions and data, right? No other than Ada Lovelace was the first person I know who wrote a piece about this punch cards, the history of punch cards, and she traces the story of what she calls the art of waving, right? So mentioning also that somehow the punch cards come from an artistic background. I must say that, of course, I needed to go back to the dark room. In a long while, I haven't been there. And doing experiments with punch cards and photography and see what can I do there. And I discovered simple things. Let's say some images like these parts that are like darker a little bit, apparently is not just the punch card, but there was another element, like a translucent paper, like a cellophane paper, something like that. Apparently he was mixing also the punch card with other materials. So, conclusions. The first thing is that I would like to propose that these kind of examples must be taken into account when talking about the history of the interaction of computers and the arts. Of course, he was not using a computer itself. It was a tabulating machine. I commented this problem with Siegfried Zielinski, and he told me eventually there is no need to, go to check what is really the first computer. Eventually, you can use terms like algorithmic artifacts that can, encompass like tabulating machines, calculators, and also computers. And eventually, that's an interesting thing. The other thing that is very important to me is that to rediscover the artistic origins of the punch cards through the work of this Brazilian experimental artist. And also how we can learn from, the recontextualization by artists of the icons of the information age. So contribution, I think last time in this conference I closed with the idea of the many languages that the technology can speak. I closed with the idea that technology speaks Spanish. I must say this time that technology speaks Portuguese, right? Because we are talking about a Brazilian example. Linking with what happened in the emerging, in the Bridges session, when there was, mentioned the need of talking about the global histories of media arts. What I would like to point out is that it's a necessity to talk about in a global way, because media arts are a global phenomena, or mondial, as I still prefer in the French connotation of the term. So there's the need, and here we are, right? So that kind of taking the risk to expose these kind of things. And the other thing that I would like to mention also is, for you, I mean, eventually it's important for everybody, for the artists who are engaging with this task of, telling stories about media histories in different countries, and you still have like this creative energy inside. You try to go experimental, try to put your hands on your materials, make that part of your research, because I think that's very valuable. And that's all. 15 or what? Thanks.
Congratulations.